Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today, we're going to try to tackle some pretty big questions about biblical history and what it all might mean for us in the world today.
Sounds intense.
It is. So there's this YouTube conversation, right, between Apollo. He's a relatively new Christian, still kind of figuring things out.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. And then there's Philip Shipman. He's been researching biblical artifacts and ancient texts for years.
Oh, wow. That's a long time.
It is. Shipman has some pretty interesting takes on things, like this concept of a seed war.
A seed war?
Yeah, basically this ongoing battle between, good and evil forces. And he traces it all the way back to the beginning.
Went to the Garden of Eden.
Exactly, the Garden of Eden. He even suggests that that whole thing with Eve and the serpent, maybe it wasn't just about a fruit.
Oh, interesting. What else could it have been about?
Well, that's where things get a little more complicated. Shipman proposes this idea that Eve's interaction with what he calls the Bashan.
The Bashan?
Yeah, it's this being, he says. This being might have been, it might have been a sexual union.
Whoa, okay. That's a new take.
Right. And Shipman says this is what introduced, the concept of the flesh into humanity.
The flesh. What do you think he means by that?
That's a good question. It's like the part of us that's driven by desires and impulses, those baser instincts that can lead us away from God. And it sets the stage for this whole ongoing conflict.
The seed war.
Exactly. This battle between good and evil that plays out through, Shipman thinks it plays out through the entire Old Testament.
Oh, wow. So like all those stories about giants and mythical creatures, are those part of the seed war too?
That's exactly what he's suggesting. He thinks those stories could be like echoes of this ancient conflict, hinting at this whole deeper spiritual reality that we often miss. It's almost like these creatures represent the twisting of God's creation by these negative forces.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
So he's basically saying we should look beyond the surface of those stories and think about the deeper spiritual meaning.
Yeah, he's saying they might offer insights into the spiritual battles that are still happening today. And he uses the flood as a pretty dramatic example of how this war plays out.
The flood, like Noah's Ark.
Yes. But Shipman presents a unique interpretation. He suggests that God was deeply saddened to destroy his creation.
Right.
But he had to. It was necessary to cleanse the earth of this rampant corruption. He even proposes that the corruption wasn't just limited to land creatures, which, it makes you wonder about what might be hidden beneath the ocean.
That's true. What could be down there?
I know, right? It really makes you think. But let's bring it back to how the seed war continues to play out. Shipman dives into some pretty key concepts. Blood sacrifice, the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, this should be good.
It is. He spends a lot of time talking about the importance of blood sacrifice, which is central to both Judaism and Christianity. He focuses on this whole mystery surrounding blood. Blood is the life source, its connection to forgiveness of sins. And he doesn't shy away from the parts that are harder to understand.
Yeah, some of that stuff can be tough to wrap your head around.
It really can, but Shipman's not afraid to tackle it head on. He's like, okay, this is a mystery, it's uncomfortable, but let's talk about it. And it's within this context that he brings up the Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant, the one with the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, but Shipman goes beyond those traditional interpretations. He speculates about its function, suggesting it might have acted like a capacitor or even a weapon.
A weapon, wow.
Right. He points to the effects it had in certain biblical stories, and then there's the whole mystery of its disappearance, which, makes you wonder, where did it go, and what role did it play in this ongoing seed war?
I mean, it's been missing for centuries. People have been searching for it forever. So where does Shipman think the Ark went?
He offers his own theories, which only add to the intrigue. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about how this seed war plays out as Christianity goes from a persecuted faith to a major world power.
Okay, so from the margins to the mainstream.
Yeah.
How does that change things?
Shipman argues that this shift actually led to a distortion of Christ's original message.
Oh, interesting. How so?
He points to figures like Clovis, who used Christianity to justify conquest and violence. He contrasts them with the early martyrs who died for their faith without ever resorting to force.
So like one group used faith for power, and the other group's faith gave them power.
Exactly. It raises a really important question for all of us. How do we navigate the complexities of power and faith in a world where it's so easy for the two to get tangled up?
Yeah, especially in today's world. How do we know we're doing it right?
That's a question we're all wrestling with, I think. And it leads us directly into Shipman's analysis of how this ancient seed war is manifesting in the modern world. He sees the enemy's fingerprints all over some of the biggest issues we face today.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear about that.
Me too. But first, I think we need to look closer at how this seed war plays out in the Old Testament. How does it shape those events, those pivotal figures?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. I'm ready to dive deeper into those stories.
Me too. Let's see how Shipman connects those Old Testament events to this whole idea of the seed war and see what we can learn from it.
Sounds good to me.
Let's do it. All right, so we're talking about this seed war, right? This ancient battle between good and evil and how it echoes through the Old Testament. Where do we even begin to unpack that?
Well, Shipman starts with a story that pretty much everyone knows, Cain and Abel. You know, the first murder in the Bible.
Oh yeah, classic sibling rivalry gone wrong.
Right. But Shipman sees it as way more than that. He sees it as like a direct result of the seed war playing out.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does he connect those dots?
Well, he focuses on the fact that Cain's sacrifice is rejected by God. And Shipman interprets this as a straight-up rebellion against God's plan. Like Cain is choosing to side with the forces that are trying to mess with the lineage, the bloodline, that will eventually lead to the Messiah.
So it's not just about jealousy between brothers. It's about this deeper spiritual struggle, like Cain's making a conscious choice to align with the wrong side.
Exactly. It makes you think, how often are our own conflicts, the ones that seem personal, actually rooted in something much deeper, something spiritual?
That's a really good question. It's like we're all caught up in this bigger battle, whether we realize it or not.
Right. And Shipman argues that the seed war is happening all the time, just often in ways that are hidden from us. Then he moves on to Noah and the flood, and he paints a pretty vivid picture of what the world was like before that whole catastrophe.
I am all ears. What does he say?
He describes a world that is just consumed by corruption. He says those negative angelic forces, those offspring of the Bashan, they were everywhere, distorting God's creation, corrupting the human bloodline. It was like the enemy was pulling out all the stops to prevent the Messiah from ever coming.
Wow, that's a pretty intense image. It makes the flood seem less like, a random natural disaster and more like a necessary intervention.
Exactly. It's like this desperate attempt to hit the reset button, to cleanse the earth and give humanity another chance.
And it kind of makes sense in the context of this seed war. It's not just punishment, it's preservation.
Exactly. It's about protecting that line of good, that potential for redemption. Shipman even suggests that the covenant God makes with Noah afterward, the promise to never flood the earth again, it reflects how heartbroken God was to have to do it in the first place.
Yeah, that adds a whole other layer to that story. So the flood happens, it's this big reset, but the seed war, it doesn't end there.
Oh, it definitely continues. Shipman dives deeper into this idea of blood sacrifice in the Old Testament.
Great. That's one of those things I've always struggled with. Why blood? What's so special about it?
I think a lot of people feel that way. And Shipman admits it is a mystery. But he points out that the Bible calls blood the life source. And it's something sacred, something powerful.
Right, I've heard that before. But how does it connect to this seed war?
Shipman believes blood sacrifices were a way for humanity to acknowledge its sinfulness, to seek forgiveness through the shedding of innocent blood. And he ties it all back to Jesus, whose blood, Christians believe atones for the sins of all humanity.
So those Old Testament sacrifices were like foreshadowing what was to come. It's like a thread running through history pointing towards redemption.
That's exactly how he sees it. And this is where his discussion of the Ark of the Covenant gets really interesting.
Oh yeah, the Ark. We talked about that in the last part. What does he say about it now?
He suggests that the Ark, with its mysterious power and connection to the divine, might have actually played a role in facilitating those blood sacrifices, like some kind of conduit between the earthly realm and the heavenly.
Whoa, that's a tricky thought. Like the Ark was amplifying the power of those sacrifices.
Right. And then he even connects it back to the Ark's disappearance. He suggests that maybe its purpose in this whole seed war had been fulfilled, and that's why it vanished.
It's like it served its purpose and then moved on to who knows where. Okay, so we move from the Old Testament to the rise of Christianity as this global power. How does Shipman see the seed war playing out in that transition?
Well, he argues that as Christianity gained influence, it became vulnerable to a different kind of corruption. He's concerned that the true message of Christ got distorted along the way.
That's interesting. In what way?
He points to the alliance between the early church and rulers like Clovis, who used Christianity to justify war and violence, and he contrasts those figures with the early martyrs, the ones who were persecuted and killed but never fought back.
Yeah, there's a big difference there. It's like one group used their faith to gain power, while the other group's faith gave them the strength to resist worldly power.
Exactly. And Shipman seems to be saying that the early martyrs understood something really important about the nature of true strength. It's not about fighting fire with fire. It's about standing firm in your faith, even when it costs you everything.
That's a powerful message, especially today when it feels like there's so much pressure to compromise our beliefs to fit in or to achieve success. But how do we resist that pressure? How do we stay true to our faith in a world that often seems hostile to it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it leads us directly into Shipman's analysis of how this seed war is playing out in our modern world, like right now. He sees the enemy's influence in some of the most pressing issues we face as a society.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How does he connect this ancient spiritual battle to the things we're dealing with in the 21st century? What does that even look like?
Well, he points to some pretty specific examples. For one, he sees the breakdown of the traditional family structure as a deliberate attack by the enemy. Remember how he emphasized lineage and bloodlines in the seed war?
Yeah, he talked about how the enemy was trying to corrupt the bloodline that led to the Messiah.
Right, and he sees these modern attacks on the family as a continuation of that strategy. It's about weakening the bonds between people, separating them from God.
I mean, it's hard to argue that the family isn't under attack these days. Divorce rates are high. The definition of marriage is changing.
Exactly. And Shipman sees these trends as part of a bigger plan to undermine the very foundation of society, which he believes is the family.
So it's not just about personal choices or changing social norms. He's saying there's a deeper, more sinister force at work.
That's his argument. He also points to the increasing sexualization of children and the push for things like transgender ideology. He sees these as attempts to distort God's design for humanity, to separate us from our true identity.
I can see how those topics could be controversial.
Oh, absolutely. These are sensitive issues, and Shipman's views are definitely not going to sit well with everyone.
Right. It's important to be respectful of all viewpoints, even if we don't agree, but I think his underlying point is still worth considering. Could there be a spiritual dimension to these cultural shifts that we're seeing? And if so, how do we respond as people of faith?
Those are the questions we all need to wrestle with. And it leads us into another trend that Shipman is concerned about: the rise of secularism.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a decline in traditional religious values in many parts of the world. What does Shipman make of that?
He sees it as a deliberate campaign to push faith to the margins of society. It's about creating a world where God is no longer recognized or honored.
So it's not just people naturally drifting away from religion. He's saying there's a deliberate effort to silence those who believe.
That's what he's suggesting. He believes the enemy wants to erode our moral compass, to leave us vulnerable to deception and manipulation. He even sees the fascination with UFOs and extraterrestrial life as potentially part of that deception.
The UFO thing, that's interesting. How does he connect that to the seed war?
Well, he suggests that these beings, if they even exist, might present themselves as benevolent, offering us advanced knowledge or technology, even a new path to salvation. But Shipman warns that it could all be a trick, a way to distract us from the true source of salvation, which is God.
It's like that saying, all that glitters is not gold. Just because something seems appealing on the surface doesn't mean it's good for us in the long run.
Exactly. And that's his message in a nutshell. He's calling for a return to the basics, a deeper understanding of Scripture, and a more discerning approach to the information and ideas that are constantly bombarding us.
So it's about being wise, about not being swayed by every new trend or fad, but really grounding ourselves in our faith. But if we're not supposed to fight back against these negative forces in the same way they're fighting us, how do we protect ourselves and the people we care about? What does that even look like in a world that feels increasingly hostile?
That's the question we're going to tackle in the final part of this deep dive. Shipman offers some really practical strategies for engaging in this spiritual battle, and it might not be what you expect.
Okay, so we've talked about this seed war and how it's playing out in our world, but how do we actually protect ourselves and our families, especially when it feels like things are getting kind of crazy out there?
That's a really big question. One that people of faith have wrestled with forever. It's tough. Like, how do we balance loving our enemies with, protecting the people we love?
Yeah, it feels like a constant struggle, especially now. Like, things feel so uncertain, so dangerous sometimes. How do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, Shipman, he gets that. He really does. But he says true security, it comes from something deeper, something beyond ourselves.
What do you mean?
He's saying when we fight the enemy on his terms, with violence or aggression, it's like we're giving him more power.
So we have to, resist that urge to fight back with the same tactics.
Exactly. He says true strength comes from surrender. Surrendering our need to control everything and trusting in God. He uses the example of those early Christian martyrs, the ones who faced such horrific persecution, but they never fought back.
Right. They just stood firm in their faith, even when it cost them their lives.
Yeah. And their unwavering faith, that's what made their message so powerful. It was like they were tapping into this force that the enemy couldn't touch.
So it's like choosing not to fight back. Choosing love and forgiveness, that's actually the strongest weapon we have.
That's what Shipman believes. He's saying when we operate from a place of love, forgiveness, trusting God, well, that's a power the enemy can't defeat. It's a power that can literally change the world.
So it's not about being passive or weak. It's about fighting differently.
Exactly. And Shipman offers some pretty practical ways to do that. He says, instead of getting caught up in arguments or, trying to force our beliefs on others, we need to focus on showing God's love.
Like let our actions speak louder than words.
Yeah. Just being a living example of what we believe.
Mm-hmm.
He also talks a lot about forgiveness. Forgiving even when it feels impossible, especially when we've been really hurt.
Man, forgiveness is tough.
It is. But he says holding on to anger, it just eats us up inside. It gives the enemy a foothold. And forgiveness, it's not about saying what happened was okay. It's about freeing ourselves from that pain, that bitterness.
So it's about taking care of ourselves too, not just the person who hurt us.
Yeah. Shipman says when we forgive, it's like we're opening ourselves up to God's grace. That's where the real healing happens.
It's like we're breaking free from those chains and finally able to move forward.
But he's clear about one thing. This kind of spiritual warfare, it's not easy. It takes courage, discipline, a willingness to be different, to go against the flow.
Yeah, it can feel really lonely sometimes, like everyone else is doing things one way and we're choosing a different path.
But remember, we're not alone. We have the Holy Spirit and we have each other.
Like a community of warriors fighting for the same things.
Exactly. And Shipman, he wants us to remember that this battle, it's bigger than just us. It's been going on since the beginning, and our choices, they matter.
Wow. I've learned a lot from this deep dive. What do you hope people take away from all this?
Well, I think Shipman's main message is this. We have a choice. We can fight the enemy on his terms, with anger, violence, control. Or we can choose a different way. We can choose love, forgiveness, trust in God.
And that choice makes all the difference.
It really does. And as we've seen, choosing love doesn't mean we're weak or naive. It means we're strong enough to fight a different kind of battle, a spiritual battle. It's about recognizing the enemy's tactics and standing firm in our faith.
So it's about being warriors, but warriors of the heart.
Beautifully said. And I hope this deep dive has given everyone some tools to do just that. To recognize the enemy's lies, to stand strong in their faith, and to let their lives be a reflection of God's love.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the spiritual battles that are all around us. We hope you'll continue to wrestle with these questions, to seek God's guidance, and to find your own strength in the midst of the chaos.
And to everyone listening, as you go about your day, your week, think about this. How is this ancient seed war playing out in your own life? What choices are you making? Are you aligning yourself with good? Are you resisting the forces of evil? Those are questions worth asking. Keep seeking truth. Keep asking those tough questions. And keep diving deep into the mysteries of faith and the world around you.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep the faith, and keep diving deep.